Hi everyone, Jason Kenney here to do a Facebook Live Q&A. So if you've got questions for me on any issues that you're concerned about, please just put them in the comment section below. Just thought I'd kick off with a little bit of a recap about today's very exciting announcement about our plan to open Alberta for the summer. The last 15 months have just been brutally difficult for everyone in our province. And our heart goes out, especially to those who've lost loved ones during the pandemic, to our frontline healthcare workers who've just been heroic, to the small business people who, some of whom have just been hammered, and people whose jobs have been lost, and so many others who've gone through a period of great adversity. But here is the best news I've had to deliver in the past 16 months. We are just a few weeks from the very end of the public health restrictions of a full opening of Alberta. As long as we continue to do the right thing, we have a period of time where we've just got to be a little bit cautious here to make sure we keep pushing those numbers down to relieve the pressure on our hospitals. And the more we do of that now, the more open we can be by late June, early July. So we laid out our Open for Summer plan, which begins with step one. That begins actually in part this coming Friday, where communities of faith can welcome congregations up to 15% of fire code, and that allows more exercise of worship rights. And then on the following Monday, we will move to other areas of step one, which include patio dining, for example, for restaurants and bars, for tables of up to 4, and it includes increasing to 10 the number of people who can do outdoor gatherings and outdoor recreational activities. A lot of questions about golf, that's included. Personal wellness services will reopen by appointment only. That includes hair salons. Increases in the numbers of people who can attend funerals, and retail capacity will go from 10 to 15%. And that's based on the metric of having achieved 50% of first vaccine doses administered 2 weeks prior, and our hospitalization numbers being under 800, which they already are. So we're quite confident about those dates moving forward. Then stage 2, if and when we reach 60% of the eligible population having had at least a first dose, that's people 12 and above, then 2 weeks after that, and if hospitalization numbers are below 500, then we go to stage 2, which is quite broad, number of measures, increasing recreation, entertainment, and other settings, opening theaters, museums, galleries, libraries, casinos, rec centers and arenas, opening of gyms and fitness studios for single and drop-in activities, but not large groups at that point. Increases in limits for funerals. Places of worship would go up to a third of capacity, as would retail. Restaurants will be able to provide service both indoors and out, with tables of up to 6, and youth activities will resume with some restrictions. So that would be, we estimate, if enough Albertans sign up, well, actually, 60% of first doses, we expect to hit that maybe tomorrow, in which case this would come into effect on June the 10th, and we're certainly on track to crush that spike, so we'll have hospitalizations under 500. Then the third stage, and I'm kind of summarizing what I did in my news conference today, which you can also check out below. Third stage is if we get to 70% first dose vaccines of the eligible population, and for that we need to get about another 380,000 people vaccinated. And then life's back to normal. We open everything up. We lift all of the restrictions except some in healthcare settings like nursing homes and hospitals, of course. And of course, people who are test positive with COVID will still be required to self-isolate for a couple of weeks, which is just common sense. So this is a careful, but I think it's still a bold plan to get our lives back to normal. It ensures that we drive down the numbers. I want to thank Albertans for rising to the challenge in a big way. 3 weeks back, I called on Albertans to end the spike, to stop the spike, and we are crushing the spike. We've been asking Albertans to sign up for vaccines, and they are doing so in amazing numbers. We've vaccinated 2.3 Nearly 2.3 million shots have been administered. We're at about 50% of the total population, at about 58, 59% of the eligible population of those over 12. We're leading Canada on second doses administered at over 9% of total population. And we have about 14% of the population, we estimate, with natural immunity. So you add all of those numbers together, and that's what gives us the confidence that we are starting to get to the levels of what the scientists would call population protection, or quotes, herd immunity, that other jurisdictions have with big vaccine programs, places like Israel, the UK, and others, which have allowed them to open while the COVID numbers have continued to drop. Anyway, I'll go to your questions now. First one goes to Michelle Hoffer-McNaughton, who says, how can you be so certain we'll be free of all restrictions by the end of June? Well, Michelle, the plan I've just outlined is the result of weeks of careful study and analysis by our public health team, looking at the example of other countries. And I guess when you ask what makes me sure, it's the experience of other places around the world, like I just mentioned, Israel and the UK, that have led the world on vaccines, but also the US. I'll give you an example. Texas lifted all public health restrictions back on, I think, March 10. And at that time, they only had 15% first dose vaccine coverage. They did have a higher share of population with antibodies from having been infected before. At about maybe 35% is the consensus estimate. So altogether, they had population protection in and around the 50% range when they opened fully on March the 10th. And ever since then, the numbers have been dropping in Texas and in other states with very similar contexts. And in fact, we're saying that we won't open fully until we're at 70% population protection. Another thing I would point to is, if you look at those age groups, those age cohorts in our population that are most vaccinated, like people over 70, people over 60, et cetera, you can see the infections and hospitalizations and fatalities dropping off a cliff for those groups in the population that have achieved something like 70%, 80% protection from vaccines. So there is a clear correlation between the protection from the virus, either through natural infection or first and second doses. And we've seen the real world experience, and that's what allows us to proceed with confidence. All right, next question goes to Carol Bruce Carr. What about COVID passports? We are not going to do COVID passports in Alberta. Carol, I've been clear about that. We think that it is a privacy rights violation, that others do not have a right to require you to disclose private confidential health information unless it is for very narrow and legitimate purposes, like applying for life insurance, for example. But we will not be facilitating COVID passports. So one caveat would be foreign governments may require that you go show proof of vaccination to enter their countries, and that's their right. AHS obviously does provide people who have been vaccinated with a slip that shares the information on their vaccine. How you use that is your business. Kayla Graham says, when can we get our second doses? Thousands of appointments are open and no second doses are being offered. We want ours. Thanks, Kayla. I'm glad to hear your enthusiasm. I want my second dose too. And the answer is, right now, we're trying to push as many of the first doses through the system as we can. That's the way we can get maximum protection of the population. As soon as we start, now, having said that, sorry, back up a step, we have given double doses to the most vulnerable. So our most elderly, seniors living in nursing homes and that kind of setting, they've all been double dosed, as have the staff in, for example, many frontline healthcare staff, frontline long-term care staff. So Alberta is actually, Kayla, leading Canada on the second dose administration at, I believe, 7.4% of the eligible population, those born after 1989, and 9.2% of the total population. Flip those numbers. 9.2% of the eligible population, 7.4% of the eligible population who have received a second dose in Alberta, and that's almost twice as high as the national average. So we've gone further on second doses than other provinces. But as soon as we start to see a significant decline in demand for first doses, and we actually do see lots of appointments open up, then we'll start rescheduling people in there for those second dose shots based on how long they've been waiting. Fallon Perkins says, will stage 3 include a removal of the mask restriction? Yes, Fallon, will be lifting at phase 3 at the end of June or the beginning of July, depending on meeting the metrics. We'll be lifting the provincial mask mandate, which is for indoor environments, and it's never been there for outdoor. So that's the answer to your question. Although Dr. Hinshaw may recommend mask usage in certain contexts at that point, such as obviously long-term care and hospitals, healthcare workers have their own protocols. All right, Seth Burke says, what do you have when the leader of the official opposition comments saying that your opening is too quick? I think Seth's asking me to respond to that. So I'm not surprised. The opposition New Democrat Party in Alberta has basically wanted a super hard lockdown from the beginning. They wanted the schools shut. That's been very clear. They wanted most businesses shuttered, and they've been one of the most hardcore lockdown parties in the country. And so I'm not surprised that today in the legislature they were already trying to scare people about a fourth wave, and this is too soon, and we can't have our freedoms back. All I'll say is this: look at Israel, look at Britain, look at Texas, look at Florida, look at all of the United States. Their numbers are plunging while they've lifted their restrictions. Why? Because they have population protection through a mix of antibodies from natural immunity and vaccines. They were about 3 months ahead of us on their vaccine programs. And we see the very real world positive consequence of that. I would just make one additional point, which is that in the case of the U.S., we have now surpassed the U.S. on first dose coverage. They were ahead of us on natural infection because they let the virus run more wild, if you will. They also had more deaths to pay for that price. But we are saying that we won't be fully open until we get to 70% population protection. And most of those U.S. states opened up below 50% population protection. I think with only one state that had a rough ride on that, which was Michigan. The other roughly 49 states have seen restrictions lifted and COVID numbers and hospitalizations go down as they started to reach these critical points of population immunity, as we've seen in Europe and elsewhere. Sonia Fox, and by the way, our plan here, we didn't just sort of come up with this in the back of a napkin. This has been weeks and weeks of careful work, scientific analysis, looking at the research, the efficacy of the various vaccines on first and second doses, the efficacy of antibodies achieved through natural infection, the efficacy not just against the main so-called wild variant of COVID-19, but also the efficacy of these vaccines and natural immunity against all of the vaccines that we're using, the mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, as well as AstraZeneca. So we're looking at all of that. We're also looking at the current pressure in our healthcare system, our current active case numbers, the velocity by which we are declining. We look at all of that together, and that's why we're taking a careful, staged approach. We're not opening everything up right away. A careful, staged approach. I want to emphasize that, folks. You still got to stick to your guns for the next few weeks on these rules. But if we do that and we get more and more people signed up for the vaccines, we are confident that we can safely open up completely towards the beginning of July. And these other countries have proven that that is possible. So we can either live in perennial fear, which is where I guess the opposition and others would like us to be, or we can actually take yes for an answer. Because if we can't move forward with confidence at 70% protection of our population, then when can we? I mean, some are out there saying, well, this variant, that variant. So are we supposed to lock ourselves into indefinite fear and govern ourselves based on only potential worst case scenarios? that have not come to fruition in other jurisdictions with lower levels of protection? I know that for some people who are prone to fear, maybe would be comforting, but I believe at this point there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Prudence, yes, but not fear. Sonia Fox Ebbett says, what happens if cases increase after Stampede? Will businesses close? Again, we're only moving forward with opening up in July, which would include Stampede and other major summer events, because we will be at a very high level of population protection. It's not just first doses. I want to be clear about this, Sonia, because first doses are not perfectly protective. But it's also about the nearly 10% of the eligible population who have received second doses. And it's also about the nearly 15% of our population who have protection through antibodies that they got from getting sick with COVID. So you add those things together, and let's say towards the end of June we get to 70% population protection, and keep building on that as hopefully we move to 80%. And we are in a world, like I'll just share this with you. In Florida 3 weeks ago, they had a boxing match inside a closed football stadium where they closed the roof. It was an indoor event, 76,000 people. And a study concludes no evidence of viral spread or negative consequences coming from that. Numbers have continued to drop in that state. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that COVID ends on Canada Day. I'm not saying that suddenly that we go from significant to zero risk once we reach a magic, there's no magic threshold, but once we reach a threshold, quote unquote, of 70% population protection, it's not like COVID disappears. It will continue to circulate. Some people will continue to get sick from it. And sadly, some people inevitably will pass away. That is also true of other respiratory viruses. It's true of the conventional flu. It's true of a lot of other communicable health conditions and diseases. The question has never been, at least not for this government, it's never been about eliminating the risk. It's been about managing the risk, and in part about balancing the different risks. The risk to human life and our healthcare system of uncontrolled viral spread of COVID-19 versus the risk of damaging our broader social health, people's mental and emotional health through endlessly prolonged public health restrictions. Well, thankfully, once we get to 70% population protection, the notion of uncontrolled viral spread is really no longer an issue. I guess here's my point. I think at the end of the COVID debate here, what we're seeing is people on the fringes, the pro-lockdown side and the anti-restriction side, bizarrely meeting in the middle now, because the pro-lockdown crowd that think that the only and primary policy response is restrictions are undervaluing the demonstrable protective effect of the vaccines, just as some on the other fringe who like the 10% who are anti-vaccine are denying the protective effect of the vaccines. I think we should take yes for an answer. We should look at those jurisdictions that have had more advanced vaccine programs, higher levels of population protection, have dropped their restrictions as COVID has continued to fall. Again, some caution and prudence will for a long time still be necessary. If you're feeling sick, all those basic things that we've learned, if you're feeling sick, stay home, wash your hands, good hygiene, those kinds of common sense things make sense at any time of year. We'll have to continue with some of that, and we'll have to continue to address, undoubtedly, local outbreaks from time to time, perhaps in some populations that are not properly vaccinated or protected. We'll have to continue with a system of testing and contact tracing, and we'll have to continue with, I think, some travel restrictions from COVID hotspots around the world. So there will have to continue to be some protective policies for a period of time. But the notion of indefinitely impairing our fundamental life together out of an excess of fear is not, I believe, responsible or balanced. Jay Spears says, why don't you answer the questions that are asked instead of answers that are typed for you answer the people. Hey, Jay, nice to hear from you. I just asked your question and didn't really have much in there. So if you want to put, I'll just ask the team. If Jay actually has a real question, we'll put it up there too. All right. And by the way, Jay, these are real questions. If you want to, if you don't have anything else to do tonight for a cure for insomnia, you'll be able to go through every question that I've read and answered, and you'll be able to see that it was put up in the comment section below. And then you can go to, if you really want to go to town, and if you're, really cynical, you can check out the accounts of the people who put these questions up. They are real accounts, real people, as far as we know, and we just ask a representative cross-section of these questions. I could do like other political leaders do and only ask questions from the elite mainstream media at news conferences, but instead I put myself out there once every week or two to take, usually about 30 questions from regular folks like yourself. We can't answer thousands, there's just not time. So we do our best, Jay, so, give me a bit of a break here. We just asked your question. Tanya Koziak says, where do high school graduations fit into this plan? And by the way, Jay, I'm not reading any answers. I'm just looking straight into the camera. That's the screen. All we have is the questions up here. Where do high school graduations fit into this plan? So, Tanya, high school graduations would fall into what we call broader category of gatherings. And we will be moving to 150 people for outdoor gatherings at stage 2. That could be as early as June the 10th. So my advice to you, if you're hoping to graduate and to your school, other classes that are looking forward to that big rite of passage would be to plan for an outdoor event after June the 10th, maybe after June the 12th, just for a margin of error. But I think we should be moving to stage 2 at June the 10th. And then after, like, if you guys really want to delay it and have a great party, a great blowout, I would delay it into July, because then we should be into stage 3 and you can have a regular graduation with unlimited numbers, indoor or outdoor. All right, next question, please. Goes to Heather Bratrud. Says, you talked a lot about natural immunity today. If you've had COVID and received the first vaccine, would you be considered fully vaccinated and thus not required to isolate? No, Heather. So if you've had COVID, you tested positive, you have antibodies, the degree of protection can vary based on the person and how long ago they were sick. But generally, the scientific research indicates that antibodies through natural infection have been very effective at protecting people from repeat illness and severe symptoms. And so far, I think with the exception of the P1 Brazilian variant, the evidence is very strong that natural immunity is quite strong against different variants. Now, there's a lot of different studies and there's different variants, but that's, I think, a fair general comment. But we still invite people who have gotten COVID to get their vaccination, because it just adds another level of protection. And if you go out and get a first dose, then we would strongly encourage you to get the second dose to complete the course, because both for Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, the 3 vaccines under use in Alberta, their scientific protocols and their terms of use are all for double dose protocols. So why not, if you've got that first dose and you were sick, go and get the second dose, and then you're going to have super high levels of protection. You're going to have virtual superpowers. And so I think that's a good thing to do. Our Zach Nelson says, why is there so much negative stuff on here today? It's a great day for people. Thank you, Zach. Thank you. I agree. I guess a couple things is some people have a hard time taking yes for an answer, and other people are just, perhaps understandably, after the past 15 months, there's been so much kind of fear spread around that some people that's become a habit of mind, if it were. We're going to have to challenge ourselves. First of all, challenge ourselves to continue to be disciplined for the next few weeks. This is not an invitation to let it rip, folks. We're doing great work as Albertans in crushing the spike and in getting vaccinated. but we just have to continue the momentum because we don't want to delay any of these timelines that we've outlined. We want to speed them up. And you can be part of that. You can be part of that by pushing down the COVID numbers, by staying safe, carefully following the rules, which include no indoor socializing right now. It includes limits of 5 for outdoor socializing. It includes all of those other difficult restrictions. We're pleading with you to keep those for a few more weeks as they get gradually relaxed. So we're in a position towards the end of June, beginning of July, to bring back our normal lives. But also, please get vaccinated. Zach, thanks for the optimism. Richard Adrian says, does Alberta have a plan for economic recovery in our energy sector? Yes, Richard, very much so. I mean, our government ran on a plan, but then we hyper boosted it in June of last year with the Alberta Recovery Plan, the first government in Canada to publish a detailed economic recovery plan to get through and past COVID. It includes strategies for all the major sectors in our economy, first and foremost being the energy sector. I would ask our team to please link in the comments section below a link to the Alberta Recovery Plan. You can see the energy section there. We've been doing this through, we squeezed $1 billion out of the federal government for the well reclamation program to get a lot of blue collar oil field service people back to work. We brought in as we promised, the Royalty Guarantee Act, which creates investor certainty about the royalty tax framework in the province so we won't repeat the instability that drove investment and jobs out of the province in 2008 and 2015. We have got an equivalency agreement with the Government of Canada. So Alberta exercises our authority over the regulation of major industrial CO2 emissions, which we estimate is going to save billions of dollars for the industry over time. We got an agreement with the federal government to allow Alberta to manage northern woodland caribou habitat, which might sound like a bit of an obscure issue, but it was a huge threat to the oil and gas sector in northern Alberta. We largely resolved that. We got Alberta to have authority over methane regulation, saving the oil and gas industry at least $600 million a year. We have abated property taxes for dry shallow gas producers. We negotiated a critical agreement on the transportation of gas in the summer. It's a technical issue, but that helped to move gas prices from like 30 cents for AECO to what is now $2.90. So strong days for the natural gas industry. We are on track through Enbridge to see the completion of the Line 3 replacement by the end of this year, which would add nearly 400,000 barrels a day of additional export ability for Alberta oil. We're on track with the Trans Mountain expansion. And I'm told as well with Coastal GasLink leading to the future Shell LNG or LNG Canada project on the West Coast, we are doing everything we can to support another consortium of Alberta gas producers for a second potential major LNG line and project. And most importantly, prices coming back. We're trading WTIs bouncing around $65, WCS $52. So our companies are repairing their balance sheets. Investment is coming back into the industry, which is critically important. And we have a lot more good news to come. Alexandra Alexa says, why has there been no penalty enforcement on people who have tested positive for COVID and are not self-isolating? Well, Alexandra, there may have been. I mean, there have been a lot of tickets issued for violations of public health measures. I don't know what number may have been in those cases, but I do know that our enforcement agencies have stepped up their game to ensure that there is real meaning behind the public health measures. And that's a good point, Alexandra. I think the single most important thing that people can do right now and continue to do is if they are feeling sick, stay home and get tested. If you test positive for COVID, follow the self-isolation requirements. Understand that we are offering support. If you need to take time away from work or need to leave your family, we provide free hotel accommodation and food for 2 weeks plus $630, plus the federal government will give you $1,000 for that 2-week period. So the single most important thing you can do is to self-isolate if you're sick with COVID. The second most important thing you can do is to get vaccinated. All right, Shalane Stebner says, you kept saying during the announcement today, Monday, June 1st. Sorry, did you mean Monday, May 31st or Tuesday, June the 1st? Okay, if I misstated that, I apologize about that earlier today, but the first element of the stage 1 will be May 28th, which is this Friday, and that relates to 15% of fire code capacity for congregational worship. And then June the 1st, we will move to stage 1. So I'm sorry if I confuse the day and the date. So that, all right. Lee Cook says, are you going to stop companies, theaters, concerts from not allowing unvaccinated from entering? No. For me, Lee, it's frustrating if we have a small fraction of the population that won't be part of this team effort to protect us all. But at the end of the day, we're not going to have Big Brother step in and ask people for private health information. There's no precedent for that. And the important thing is that once we really get to high levels of population protection, increasingly those people who don't get vaccinated are mainly a risk to themselves. Liam Farrer says, other provinces have put in a longer system of restrictions. Aren't you worried that the end of June is too soon? Well, no, we're not worried, Lee. We are moving forward carefully. I keep emphasizing that this is not happening all at once. This is going to happen gradually through multiple, 3 steps. And by the way, if we don't hit these thresholds, then we won't open fully at the end of June. It's up to Albertans, not the government at this point. It's up to Albertans to respond. But let me just say this. Based on where we are now, we have 600,000 appointments for vaccines over the next month, and that's growing every day. If all 600,000 of those people were to show up, we would be at about 75% population protection. And embedded in that kind of population protection number are the 14% or so who have antibodies, as well as the 9 growing to 10% who have been double dosed. That is a higher level, let me be clear, a higher level of population protection than for other major jurisdictions around the world that have pretty much opened fully without negative consequences. So, there's no scientific basis to imagine that Alberta is radically different than those other jurisdictions. To the contrary, we have a younger population than the rest of Canada, younger than many European countries, younger than Britain, for example. That counts in our favor. And we're headed into the summer. We have seasonal tailwinds moving in our favor as well. I'll remind you that last summer we had pretty modest public health restrictions, no vaccines, but very low levels of COVID, confirmed cases, active cases, hospitalizations, and fatalities. That was, again, with no or very low population protection. We might have been at 5% of an infection rate then. So if that was last summer, let's fast forward to this summer, and we're at 70, 75% population protection, plus the weather and seasonal conditions in our favor, then that is what leads us to conclude that this is a prudent approach. All right, Ranj Rafiq says, how do you see post-COVID Alberta economy? Do you expect a boom? Yes, Ranj, great question, and I do expect to see a boom. Not just me, I'm not the only one who expects that, but we have almost all of the major chartered banks and think tanks like the Conference Board of Canada have all projected that Alberta will lead Canada's economy in 2021 with between 6 and 8% growth of our provincial gross domestic product. That, by any measure, qualifies as a boom. We're already seeing it in a number of sectors. We had last year the second best year in history for farm revenues. And so far, we're off to a really strong 2021 in agriculture. We are experiencing the best year ever in terms of revenues and jobs and investment for our forestry industry. Stay tuned, some exciting announcements to come up on that front. The best year ever in the formation of venture capital last year, a doubling of our previous record high for venture capital. That's the kind of investment that drives the digital IT and tech industries. We are seeing so far already our best ever year for the tech industry in Alberta. Very exciting announcement coming up, another one on that front in Calgary next week. Best year in history for the film and television industry. We'll be making a formal announcement in the near future about the largest ever Canadian film and television production happening right here in Alberta, starting later this year. We've seen major global companies making announcements about major new investments here. So once the shackles come off the service industry, like the hospitality sector, once tourism returns, a big industry here, that's going to bring a lot more people back to work. And of course, commodity prices have come back strong. I mentioned earlier, we're selling, our benchmark oil price has gone from minus $20 in a year ago to plus $65 WTI now. And most forecasts are for global Brent crude oil prices of $80, $85 in the third quarter, which would mean probably getting potentially $65, $70 for Western Canadian Select. So investment is going to start returning in a big way to the oil and gas sector. Huge announcements that are going to be made later this year about the nascent future multi-trillion-dollar hydrogen industry, which is really going to help to drive diversification. We're very close to some exciting developments on petrochemicals, although we're fighting with the federal government on some of their stupid regulations that may be slowing that down. But on so many of these areas, I think we're set for not just a boom, but I call it an Alberta renaissance. So thanks for that question, Raj. Hanoka, just one word, one name, says, is vacation required to attend post-secondary schools in the upcoming fall semester? No. And in fact, we've made it clear, Hanoka, that the universities cannot require that. They can and should encourage students and staff to be vaccinated, just as we are, but there will not be vaccine passports, and particularly not for institutions that are part of the broader Government of Alberta family. Just 1 second, please. All right, Dana Sales says, are you keeping track of the people that are dying in the hospital right now that already have the vaccine? This is a problem because it means there is a problem you're not addressing. The vaccine doesn't work at all, but you're still acting like it does. Well, Dana, we do keep very close track. And I just have to tell you straight up that your statement there is completely inaccurate. All you have to do, Dana, you don't have to believe me. All you have to do is Google. I'll suggest Google COVID vaccine effectiveness or COVID vaccine efficacy. And you will see articles summarizing dozens of clinical trials and real-world experience that demonstrate the enormous protective effect of the vaccines. We see it here in Alberta. Dana, during the second fall-winter spike, we were losing, I think it was 28 people a day on average at the height of that spike. But recently we've been experiencing more like 5 daily deaths or fewer on average. Some days it's 8 or 9, some days it's 1 or 2, but about 5 on average. So our death rate has plummeted. It has plummeted. Why? Because we started vaccinating people. We started vaccinating the most vulnerable. The deaths are down most amongst the most elderly who are most vulnerable to the disease. Why? Because 86% of people over the age of 80 have been vaccinated. 87% of those over the age of 70 have been vaccinated. Now, if you're implying that people are dying in hospital because of the vaccine, that is completely false. We have administered over 1.2 million doses, excuse me, 2.2 million doses. And as of, bear with me, I just want to get you exactly the correct number of adverse outcomes. I think it's about 400. So, well, I'll come up with that in a minute. But I just wanted to say, here we are. Perhaps I could ask the team to find me the number for adverse events. But I'll just say this. Most of those adverse events, there's been like, I think about 390 adverse events out of 2.2 doses administered in Alberta. And most of those adverse events are things like nausea. There is one confirmed death as a result tied to a vaccination in Alberta. That was a blood clot issue emanating from an AstraZeneca dose. But that's one death out of 2.2 million doses versus 2,100, nearly 2,200 COVID deaths in Alberta last year. So the vaccines are safe. Again, if you don't believe Canadian scientists and the Canadian data, look at Texas. How do you think they opened wide open, while the numbers continue to plummet? It's because they were 3 months ahead of us in the vaccines. If you don't believe them, look to Israel. Israel, the world leader on vaccines. And it's a very high-tech, tech-savvy country. Israel, COVID has been almost obliterated in terms of its serious health consequences and fatalities because they reached population immunity. So I would plead with you and others, do not believe or repeat false information. You are holding back our efforts to open up. So, yeah, I was all exactly right. 385 adverse events. I said 390. 385 adverse events as of May 25th. So we're talking about 99.999% safety. And in terms of efficacy, the studies, there's a lot of issues about against which variant and first or second dose. But broadly, the mRNA vaccines have been determined after massive real-world use in places like Britain and Israel and elsewhere to be about 90% effective at preventing infection and about 98% effective at preventing severe outcomes like death. It's not impossible that someone should get sick after they've been vaccinated, but it's very unlikely. I quoted a stat today, and maybe our team could source this and post it just to confirm, but I'm speaking from memory. My recollection is the Public Health Agency of Canada has tabulated data, and they've been able so far to identify about 6,800 cases of people that received a COVID vaccine who subsequently became infected out of a population of about 22 million doses administered. So again, 22 million doses administered in Canada, roughly, and less than 7,000 confirmed cases of infection from those 22 million. So yes, it's possible, but it is highly, highly unlikely. Let's be clear about that. All right, Paul Newman says, when will you release the report on reestablishing an Alberta provincial police force? Well, we haven't received it yet, Paul. I saw a preliminary report that we commissioned, I think from Price Waterhouse, and we'll wait for the final report. Obviously, the government will need some time to digest that, and then we'll release that in due course to allow for a proper and informed public debate on that issue. So I see that the RCMP union has been saying the government received a report. We have not received the full report. At least I'm not aware of that, and I was just briefed on the preliminary report about 3 weeks ago. Shaylana Faye says, what does border entry look like for Canadians returning from the U.S.? Well, the rules have not changed on that, and the federal government controls those rules, not us. So, Shailana, my understanding is it's the same thing. You've got to come here with proof of a negative PCR test. Is it 48 or 72 hours before you arrive? And then you need, you should go to the CBSA website here rather than taking my word, because I might be wrong on some details, but I think then you need to take another test upon arrival. And depending on your circumstances, you may have to stay at a hotel for a couple days. Then you have to self-isolate at home for another couple of weeks. That's a general summary, but I would just go to the Canada Border Services Agency website. Maybe I'll ask our team to put a link on that below just to give you the exact specifics. John Timms says, Premier, this spring session, we've seen a very busy period in the legislature. Do you foresee the fall session being as busy, if not more, given that we're starting to look beyond COVID? Thanks, John. Good question. Actually, we'll, I think, have a kind of regular paced fall session. But as we emerge from this spring 2021 session, I estimate that our government will have implemented nearly 90% of our election platform commitments. And there will only be a handful of bills, of proposed laws, coming out of our platform that we have not yet passed through the legislature. And this is awesome because we're only halfway through our 4-year mandate. It will give us an opportunity as we emerge from COVID and these multiple crises this summer to take a bit of a step back, listen to Albertans, and renew and reboot our agenda. One way that we'll be doing that this summer will be a kind of relaunch of our Alberta Recovery Plan that we started last year. So we've done a lot of additional policy work on that jobs and growth plan that we'll be releasing details of in a few weeks. But there, we'll probably, I think we're looking right now at about 15 bills in the fall session. But I guess my main point is we will have largely achieved what we promised to do for Albertans because we've been working so hard. Last year, many legislatures stopped sitting for months on end, including the federal parliament. Alberta's legislature worked harder and achieved more than any Canadian legislature. We sat more days and passed more bills. We had record-breaking productivity in Alberta's legislature last year, despite the pandemic. It is true that we just took a couple of weeks back in our constituencies during the height of the third spike because we didn't want to, we wanted to lead by example and avoid travel. And we're going to extend our sitting here into June to get all of our work done. So we won't have lost any actual legislative days in the spring session. But there will continue to be important work to do, and just stay tuned. Deb Gomke says, how can the stampede go ahead when we don't know if we'll be at stage 3 for sure? Well, Deb, the stampede is scheduled this year to begin on July the 9th. You're right, we don't know for 100% sure when we'll reach that 70% threshold of population protection. But all indications are that we will reach that level before the second week of July. And I'll just run you through the numbers. I've actually got them here. So, or do I? I think I do. Yeah. So, Deb, tonight we're probably at about 59%. I don't have tonight's final report. We're at about 59% of the eligible population have received about a first dose. We have 76,000 bookings today, tomorrow. So we will surpass the 60% threshold to go into phase 2 weeks from now, which would be June 10th. Then we have we will need to reach 380,000 vaccines between now and June the 15th in order to open up fully at the beginning of July. That would get us to that 70% target. And we have 404,000 bookings, at least we did as of last night. I suspect we got a bunch more today. So even if we see some no-shows, and even if we see no additional people getting appointments for vaccines, we are scheduled to reach the 70% threshold by June 30th, July the 1st. Now, it would take something, it would require hundreds of thousands of people not showing up for their vaccines and no one else trying to get vaccinated, really, for us to fall short of that target by the 9th of July. Now, having said that, we have been working with the Stampede for months, and we have come up with a plan B in that extremely unlikely scenario that we don't hit the 70% threshold. And in that instance, we have a contingency plan that would allow for basically a 50% contingency in terms of the permitted numbers to participate in major summer events like Stampede. So we have a backup plan, but we really don't think we're going to have to call upon it. Okay, Anne Cran says, thank you, Premier Kenney, for giving us a more positive update. Thank you, Anne. Yes, it is nice. Isn't it nice to have some real grounds for optimism and hopefulness at this point? And thank you all for your patience in getting us here. Patricia Gertson-Cole says, please be more clear about the vaccination passport. Your answer was vague. I don't think it was vague, Patricia. So I'll try to be as clear as I can be. There are no vaccine passports in Alberta. There will be no vaccine passports in Alberta. Period. Full stop. I hope that's clear enough, Patricia. All right. Devin Shannon says, how do we treat people coming in from other provinces and countries wanting to travel to Canada for the Stampede? Do they have to be vaccinated? Okay, Devin. So international travel restrictions are entirely within the purview of the Government of Canada. They control who enters our borders and on what conditions. And right now, they do require basically a negative test and a 14-day quarantine period. So obviously, that would be a real hindrance to travelers coming in the summer, not just for Stampede, but for other tourist events. And that's why we will be making a case to the federal government to restore the very successful Alberta travel pilot that we had in place for much of last year. The feds basically stepped in over the winter and overrode that pilot. It allowed people to come in, take a rapid test at the airport, and quarantine for like 36 hours. And we gave them the results. If they were negative, they were good to go. So we're going to be lobbying the feds to come back to that. Although I would not object at all if the feds were to maintain more stringent travel restrictions, like flight bans from serious COVID variant hotspots right now, places like India and Brazil. So I think we need a intelligent, careful, and targeted approach to travel. So I would do everything we can to limit travel from variant hotspots. Like I say, Brazil and India would be at the top of the list right now. But to facilitate travel from countries with low levels of viral spread and high levels of vaccination and protection, like our friends in the United States, most of Europe, etc. And we will certainly be making a case for that. All right, 1 second, please. Timothy Mason says, why are we paying such a high gas at the pumps? Well, Timothy, gas prices have gone up. I mean, isn't that one of the ironies about Alberta? Is our economy partly depends on higher gas prices, but then we all get stung at the pumps when that happens. I guess, a year ago, we were giving away our oil. It's like $10 a barrel minus $20 a barrel. Now, WTI prices, which is our key benchmark, $65 a barrel. So prices have gone way up. But also, Timothy, a big part of this is the carbon taxes, right? So the feds, we scrapped the NDP carbon tax, partly to get your gas prices down. The feds then came in over top of us and imposed their carbon tax. Then they increased it, and they've increased it again to 40 cents a ton. And unfortunately, we lost our legal challenge of that, and they're just going to keep raising it. And the only way that will change if there's a new federal government after the next federal election. Candace Parker says, how did Hinshaw get all these powers, and at the stroke of a pen, it seems like she rules the province? Well, Candace, Dr. Hinshaw is the Chief Medical Officer of Health, which is a formal position recognized in Alberta law, mainly in the Public Health Act, which has been in place since about 1910. Every province across Canada has a similar position with similar powers, as does, I think, every civilized country in the world has an equivalent position, because there can be pandemics and contagious diseases which constitute a massive threat to human life and health. And in those circumstances, you need to be able to call on experts that are trained in the field of public health to provide government with advice and to exercise their authority in an appropriate and legally circumscribed way. So Dr. Hinshaw has exercised the powers that her office has been bestowed with since in various ways for the past 100 years. KT says, what's the plan to address children's mental health? Well, actually, there'll be a very important announcement. Was that made last week, or is it coming up this week? There's an announcement about the creation of a child mental health and wellness panel. It will be co-chaired by MLA for Calgary Southeast, Matt Jones. This was actually his brainchild, his idea, because of his concern, which we all share, about the mental health implications for children coping with all of this stress, schools being open and then closed, and economic pressure that their parents are living under, being detached from their friends and their broader families. We know that it's had a real impact on children. There are many times their sports and fitness activities being impaired. And so we're going to be launching, but first of all, when COVID began, we provided $100 million in funding to community organizations, in part to help with kids and their mental health. Then we provided $53 million in targeted COVID-related mental health supports, including the Kids Helpline and other psychological and counseling services for kids. And now we are appointing this mental health and wellness panel. I guess I just scooped myself. The announcement will be made tomorrow at noon. Just tune in for that. All right, Jesse Boswell says, Premier, will there be metrics that the government will be looking at if things don't go as planned and we have to roll back? Yes, Jesse. We've said throughout this document that obviously, and this just goes for any time, if we see a real and serious threat to our healthcare system that could overwhelm its capacity, we will act. Regardless of the context, we will act to protect the healthcare system, to prevent mass cancellations of surgeries, to prevent mass avoidable deaths. But Jesse, I'll come back to something I said before. COVID doesn't end on Canada Day. COVID doesn't end when we lift almost all of these restrictions. COVID, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, will continue to circulate. It will continue to infect some people. Some people get sick. And sadly, some people, a small and growing number, will die. That is true of, as I say, the regular flu influenza. We lose about 70, 80 people a year to that influenza. In the fall, October, November, it does put some pressure on our ICU wards, the regular flu does. So those things continue to circulate through the population, much like the Spanish flu did in the 1918 to 1920. Came on strong in the spring of 18, came on huge in the fall of 1918, and then eventually it started to abate, largely through herd immunity. So these things will hang around, and they will pose some kind of a marginal threat. But if we start to get to 70, 75, 80, 85%, let's hope, population protection, then all of the real-world experience we've seen across the world suggests that the serious consequences, hospitalizations and deaths, will continue to come down, just as they have for the most elderly Albertans who were vaccinated first. 83% of Albertans over the age of 70 have received at least one dose, and most of them 2 doses. 86% of those over 80 years of age have received 1 dose, and almost all of them a second dose as well. The hospitalization and fatality rates in those groups has not quite disappeared, but fallen like a rock now for months. Why? Because of the vaccines. And as we see the level of protection grow across the age spectrum in all of the other age cohorts, people in their 50s, 40s, 30s, and downward, then we will see a similar protective effect. And you're starting in those younger age cohorts with people who are less likely to get sick anyway. I mean, we have not experienced a single confirmed fatality from COVID-19 amongst an Albertan under the age of 20. So anyway, that just shares with you the reasons for, the science behind today's decision and the reason for our relative confidence. Mary Gail McLaughlin says, will Fort McMurray go to school in learning on Monday? Yes, Mary Gail. I assume you live up in Fort McMurray. I just wanted to give you guys a shout out. You've been hit hard in the past few weeks with the highest rates in Alberta, even though Fort McMurray did extremely well throughout almost all of the pandemic. Your numbers are actually very low compared to most parts of Alberta from spring of last year until this spring. So, and this is no one's fault. The disease has a mind of its own in a way, but you guys have been hit hard. And I know that your schools were closed for in-classroom instruction earlier. We've gone back to in-classroom instruction across the province as of yesterday, with the exception of Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo, and we extended that for 1 week based on our consultations with the local school boards up there, and they asked for just a few more days. So we'll be back to in-classroom instruction to finish out the academic year for students in northeastern Alberta starting next Monday. All right, Les Fox says, before COVID, you started talking about implementing legislation that would allow the citizens to be able to remove their politicians who weren't doing their job. Why have we not heard more about this legislation? Well, Les, I don't know why you haven't heard more about it. Maybe the lead media didn't talk a lot about it, but here's the good news, Les. We introduced that legislation. So there was a study done by a ledge committee last year on this. They came back with recommendations, which we turned into legislation. It is the Recall Act, and it is being debated right now in the legislature. It will, I anticipate, be passed into law in the next week or two. And so we promise made, promise kept. Less on top of that, we've also brought in another historic democratic reform, which is the Citizens Initiative legislation, which would allow 10% of Alberta voters to force a province-wide referendum on an important issue if they sign a legal petition. So that's the Citizens Initiative law that's also was introduced in the legislature in March, and it will pass this spring. Devin Shannon, will you need to self-isolate when traveling back into Canada? Do you need a vaccination? Well, I'm not sure if you mean me personally, Kevin. You just underscored that. I've not been outside of the country since January, I think, of 2020, since 20 of last year. The answer is no. The federal government has not imposed a vaccine requirement for Canadian or foreign travelers coming back to Canada. They do require that people show up with proof of a negative PCR test. John Roger, how much of a kickback do you get to let the stampede go? Isn't this hilarious? Last week I was being asked if I was getting kickbacks for closing certain businesses. Folks, by the way, the Stampede is a nonprofit community event. I know that there are some folks, typically on the political left, I saw them on Twitter all attacking the Stampede today. It's too bad they can't get into the spirit of Stampede. The vast majority of Calgarians and Southern Albertans love the Stampede as a wonderful, relaxed celebration of our Western heritage and values, of agriculture, of livestock, of family, of fun. And you know what we need most coming out of this brutal year? I think it's permission to have just a little bit of fun, to come together again as community. That's what the Stampede is all about. So, John, maybe you're going to be the kind of the Grinch who tries to, the kind of Mr. Scrooge of Stampede. I'm going to be somebody who joins our community in celebrating what we have achieved together. Let's be clear about this. If Albertans weren't signing up in huge numbers to get vaccinated, if they hadn't come together and made real sacrifices to end the third spike, to follow the public health guidelines, if it weren't for this sense of solidarity, resilience, and compassion of Albertans, we wouldn't be able to do things like get our normal lives, our freedoms back, and to enjoy community events like the Stampede. But I'm glad that we're getting to that position. And I know there are some folks out there, hopefully a tiny minority, who would like to hang on to this kind of hyper control of our society indefinitely and be afraid of fear itself and base all of our collective lives on the worst case scenarios. That's what I was hearing from the NDP in question period today. They're already trying to scare people about the fourth spike, shut it down, lock it down, keep the businesses shut, keep the schools shut. But you know what? That's not where most Albertans are at. They want us to be safe and careful. And guess what is safe and careful? Vaccines. John, take yes for an answer. Vaccines work. They're safe. If we're going to ask people to go and get vaccinated, then they've got to be able to expect the benefits of the vaccines. And perennial lockdowns are not a way to incentivize people to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their communities. So those folks who are arguing against a careful plan to open up are really saying to the vaccine hesitant, don't bother. There's really no benefit. It doesn't really protect people. It doesn't really protect the healthcare system or protect lives. Stay hoveled in your basement indefinitely. You know, that's the worst possible message to send. Let me tell you this. I hope I've asked our health department to approach, in fact, the Calgary Stampede to talk about a vaccine clinic at the Stampede. If people, younger people who might be less likely to go to the logistical hassle of making an appointment, tend to come out to the Midway and to Stampede. We can get them in a queue and they can get their jab, and we get that extra person, those extra thousands of people vaccinated. That's a health advantage. So I say, let's celebrate what we're achieving as a province. Let's do it with a sense of hope and optimism and unity. Valerie McDade says, will patios need to close at 10 p.m. or can we stay open until 2 a.m.? Valerie, I think the answer is we continued at 10 p.m. closing through the stages 1 and 2, and that will be lifted at stage 3. Yeah, so I think I got that right. All right, let's see, where are we at here? Questions. I'll just take a couple more. And I've been at this for over an hour. Tom Bodnar says, when will you move to reduce wages of the government to match citizens' losses? Well, Tom, we already did that as MLAs. I took a 10% cut as Premier. MLAs took 5% cuts. Political staff have taken 7% cuts. And beyond that, all I can say is that we are in collective bargaining with the main government unions. We appreciate the public service and the good work that many have done, especially in the healthcare system over the past 15 months. But at the same time, with an $18 billion deficit, with an economy that is smaller today than it was 5 years ago, with having just experienced one of the most brutal recessions in our economy's history, we do need to call on all of our partners in the government sector to join the private sector in showing restraint, and that informs the negotiating position that we are taking with those collective bargaining agreements. All right. Do we have one more question, maybe? Oh, here we go. Kyla Marie. Jason, terrific job you're doing. When are you going to visit Fort McMurray? Thank you for the nice comment, Kyla. I'm just going to avoid travel for a little while longer. just, because I think we've been telling people as much as possible to stay close to home base. But I sure hope to get up there soon. And just want to thank your mayor, Don Scott, MLAs, Layla Goodridge and Tani Yao, and everybody in local leadership up there, First Nations leaders and others, for helping to get Fort McMurray through this real serious spike. I hope to get up there and thank people in person. Kevin Stacey, why have you changed the rules for stages and what people are allowed to do? One time it was hospitalizations, then it was vaccinations, now it's hospitalizations and vaccinations. Why do the goalposts keep moving? Well, Kevin, I don't think the goalposts have moved. But first of all, the virus is not static. It changes. Its virulence, its lethality have changed over time with the introduction and spread of new variants, for example. So, there's not like one, it's not a simple static problem that can only be addressed by the same response. We've had, like most things in life, we've had to adapt to changing circumstances, including the changing character of the virus. One thing that has changed, very important thing, has been a growing level of population immunity through the vaccines. That's totally different. So earlier in the pandemic, really the only tool we had to protect lives in the healthcare system was public health restrictions. But now we have a much better tool, which is the vaccines. So why would we continue to rely heavily on public health restrictions when vaccines can replace their protectiveness? And so that's the best way I can answer that, Kevin. We're not changing the goalposts. We're just addressing the reality of totally different circumstances now. Ian Prime Rib, that's a clever last name, Ian. I guess you're an Alberta beef lover. When will the mask requirement be removed? The provincial mask mandate will be removed at stage 3, which would be late June, early July. It does not apply outdoors. It's for indoor locations. We ask people to continue to use that little bit of extra protection in the time being while we continue to drive these numbers down. Randy McMullen, Premier, where are we at with Michigan trying to cancel shutdown Line 5? So there's 3 procedures right now, Randy. Right now, there is a mediation between Governor Whitmer and Enbridge. We're awaiting that outcome. Secondly, there is litigation at a Michigan state court, and thirdly, in a U.S. federal court. And in part, those cases are trying to determine at which level, federal or state, does the ultimate decision-making authority rest here. Because the position of our government, of Enbridge, government of Canada, is that this is a federal matter, in part because it enjoins a Canada-U.S. bilateral treaty on the transshipment of energy through pipelines. And the interruption of the Line 5 would constitute a prima facie violation of that treaty, therefore enjoins federal U.S. law. That's the position we're taking. The legal advice that we have is that Governor Whitmer doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on, that we that's why Enbridge has continued to operate the pipeline, notwithstanding her abrogation of the permit for the portion of Line 5 that passes across the Straits of Mackinac. Long story short is it continues to operate 3 separate legal procedures. We are optimistic about succeeding on those. Debbie Pelland-Rose says, has there been any further studies available in the mixing of vaccines as a second dose if those getting AstraZeneca first doses are wondering about second doses and the time frame? Great question, Debbie. So, yeah, there have been some studies, at least one I'm aware of, out of the UK, which did indicate that people who went from AstraZeneca first dose to an mRNA second dose did so safely and actually may have enhanced protection. But we are awaiting the completion of a major UK study on exactly this question. We anticipate it will come back next week. And we'll be asking the Alberta, it's the an expert committee on inoculation. There's the National Advisory Committee on Inoculation, and the Alberta Advisory Committee on Inoculation. We'll be asking the Alberta Committee and Dr. Hinshaw to give us advice based on the data we expect to be released out of Britain on exactly this question next week, before we decide how to proceed with potential second doses of AstraZeneca. I do note that Ontario and Quebec have begun to schedule second dose appointments. We have 76,000 AstraZeneca doses in storage that are being held on our behalf by the National Operations Center, the federal government. We could call upon those. I think we have about 400 and, it's more like 250,000, 280,000 people who received AstraZeneca first dose. So if we decide to proceed with AstraZeneca second doses, I will certainly sign up for that. And we believe that we can access additional supply out of the United States because they're not using them. Here's my view. Britain has demonstrated the real world of efficacy and safety of AstraZeneca. There are issues. You obviously know about those, but we'll wait and see what the final research is on this big study next week before deciding how to proceed based on the advice of our scientific experts. These guys keep throwing more questions at me, which is fine. We've done 34 questions, so we'll go with a couple more. Tina Oblander says, doctors are on CTV News right now saying it's too soon. Do you not consult medical professionals? Of course we do, Tina. Dr. Hinshaw is a medical professional. Her whole branch at Public Health is filled with medical professionals. They consult in turn with medical professionals. And so the basic framework of what we released today is what was recommended by the Department of Health. We always, when this goes through the cabinet process, there are typically some minor changes at the margins, but we broadly have accepted the public health advice that we've gotten. And look, CTV, can I just say this? CTV and some other media go every day, there's COVID news. They tend to go to the same kind of folks who say the same kind of things over and over again. Everything is too soon. We have to lock everything down. There's the COVID zero crowd. I've just given you for the last hour and 15 minutes what I think are compelling reasons why we have to say yes to the protective effects of vaccines. Look, if we keep telling people that they should take the vaccine, but we're going to keep their lives largely and freedoms largely impaired for an indefinite period of time until any reasonable risk is completely eliminated, then why take the vaccine? What's the benefit of it? Why can't we actually, instead of living in perennial fear, why can't we actually look at the real lived experience in countries and jurisdictions around the world? Let me run through some of these again. By the way, at 70% population protection, which is for us not just about the first doses, it's also about embedded beneath that, 14% natural immunity, 9% double doses and growing. 70% population protection is a significantly higher threshold for reopening than most jurisdictions around the world that have had advanced vaccine programs. And the experience of those places, US states, the United States broadly, Israel, UK, and others, has been that once they reach that high level of population protection, they can use vaccines effectively to replace public health restrictions and see the numbers continue to go down. Now, I would ask you, why, especially as we're going in to the warm summer season with seasonal tailwinds behind us, as they were last year, why would we refuse to take on board that very real world experience? I mean, I think there's one of these folks that some of the media love to go and quote because they are sure to create a fearful headline, has been saying that they're deeply concerned that we're about to get overrun by the so-called Indian variant, which is the B1617 variant. So far, we have identified 29 confirmed cases of that variant. Now, admittedly, it's harder to identify. We have to do full genome sequencing. But, the same folks that some of the media went to a few weeks back were saying exactly the same thing about the Brazilian P1 variant. Good reason to be concerned. These variants are not a walk in the park. You've got to monitor them, test for them, try to control them. But people who were saying that we had to go to a hard and indefinite lockdown over the Brazil variant about 6 weeks ago, we've identified 2,400 cases of the Brazilian variant out of a population of 4.5 million. So, like I say, at some point we've got to say yes to the science, yes to the vaccines, and show people that there actually is a reason to get vaccinated because they protect you, your loved ones, and they allow us to replace the brutal and blunt instrument of public health restrictions. Maybe CTV could go as well tonight, if they're interested in journalistic balance, and talk to some of the people who have been unemployed for 15 months or have lost their businesses because of public health restrictions. I just got off a call with pastors and faith leaders before doing this Facebook Live. One pastor told me that he was aware of multiple suicides in his church's extended network, many of which were traceable to the adversity of this of the pandemic. Thankfully, our suicide numbers are actually province-wide down a little bit, but there is no doubt that it's also had a very real impact on people's mental and emotional health. So I would say to those who just constantly beat the drum of fear, that we should also be concerned about those other negative and broader health consequences. This is why we've been trying to walk a balanced approach. So you've got those voices on CTV, but I'm sure right now on Facebook, other people saying this isn't going far enough and fast enough. We are trying to navigate a responsible middle ground approach as we've done from the beginning. And you know what? Alberta's response has not been perfect. But by global standards, Albertans have every right to be proud of how they've risen to the huge multiple challenges of the pandemic. We've had a lower COVID death rate than Canada, lower than the other large provinces, lower than all 50 US states, lower than all but, I think, 2 European countries. And we've done that with lighter and less destructive public health restrictions than the vast majority of jurisdictions in the Western world. Not perfect, but I think a record of which Albertans can and should be proud. And you know what? With that, I'm well over time. I'm just going to wrap it up at that point. Having done 35 questions, thank you for the good questions. Sorry for those I couldn't get around to. Folks, thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your diligence. Thank you for your care for others. Thank you for crushing this spike. Thank you for helping to prevent a disaster in our healthcare system. Thank you to those of you who have been vaccinated. We have so much to look forward to. The end of this is just weeks away if we just keep doing the right things for a little while longer. If you haven't already done it, please go online at AHS right now. Please put the link on below to sign up for your vaccination. If tens of thousands more Albertans who are on the bubble about vaccination sign up, that might move forward our opening day a little bit. It's up to you now. It's in your hands. The vaccines are safe. They are effective. That's why we're able to do this. Let me run you through this again. 2.3 million doses administered with 385 negative adverse outcomes that have been registered. So we're talking 99.999% safe. This is our ticket out of it. So please do your part for your neighbors, your loved ones, your family, your community, and your province. Thank you very much, folks. Looking forward to doing this again soon.